Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the New York Studio School. This evening we have Judd Tully talking for us. Judd is a good friend of the school who, some of you may remember, curated a show of the New Sculpture Group in 1988 here at the school. He's well known for his articles in the French magazine Beaux-Arts, Art and Auction, and the Washington Post, as well as Art News. And we're looking very much forward to the topic this evening, which I think is going to be intriguing. So let's welcome Judd Tully.
Can you hear me? Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank the New York Studio School. Is this too loud? No. And especially Dean Graham Nixon for inviting me here. Also, I'd like to thank ahead of time a host of people who helped me gather this arsenal of images, which you will eventually see, and information. Quickly then, the Studio Museum of Harlem, Ed Clark, Doris Bree, Philippe and Sylvain Brier, Michael Rosenfeld, Ellen Srago, Sarah Wells, Sam Yates at the University of Tennessee, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. You can turn the lights off. Oh, do I have this? Oh, here we go. Okay, it's taped down and everything. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Joseph and Beauford Delaney were African-American artists who lived and worked in New York and Paris between the late 1920s and the early 1980s. Sons of a Methodist minister and circuit preacher from Knoxville, Tennessee, both escaped the strict environment of their Tennessee roots, as well as the all-pervasive segregation existing in the South and elsewhere at the time. In the slide you're looking at, which you'll be looking at for quite a while, but it's from circa 1908. It does say 1906 on there, but you can see Joe Delaney seated on a bench to the left and Beauford on the right. Their mother, Delia, is standing behind them next to her husband, Samuel. Both boys were greatly influenced by the intense and frugal religious life practiced by the family. Beauford was an ardent and amateur gospel singer and lover of the opera who adored the music of Mahalia Jackson and Marian Anderson. He often quoted his father's favorite biblical expressions in much of his correspondence to far-flung friends later on in Paris. Quote, "Father often reminded us that faith was the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And I think both Beauford and Joseph relied quite a bit on that over the years. Joseph recalled he and his brother playing with illustrated Sunday school cards that his father received from Germany through the Methodist Episcopal Church and drawing over them and copying the imagery. Beauford, who was born in 1901, headed to Boston in 1924 for rigorous art school training at Massachusetts Normal and the Copley Society, while his younger brother Joe, who was born in 1904, left Knoxville in 1922 and took to a freewheeling life of hopping freight trains and camping in the hobo jungles that dotted the United States. When I asked Joe Delaney if he sketched on the rails, he said, "Only in my mind." He eventually tired of that dangerous life with the Beaux and headed for New York City in classes at the Art Students League with teachers Thomas Hart Benton, Alexander Brooke, and later on he took anatomy with George Bridgman. Jackson Pollock, one of Joe's classmates in Benton's class at the League, shared a freight train riding background, and they became drinking buddies. Beauford, meanwhile, was already settled, so to speak, in the bohemian edges of the village, making a name for himself. This is by Beauford Delaney, and this is from 1929, a pencil and color drawing, and it's called Young Greek. And Delaney told a newspaper reporter in 1930, probably around the time he had a show right here, when this place was the, well, then the Whitney Studio Galleries, told a reporter in 1930, "I never drew a decent thing until I felt the rhythm of New York, as distinct as the human heart, and I'm trying to put it on canvas." This next slide, portrait of a boy from 1934, pastel on paper from the collection of Morgan State University, shows what kind of the training that Beauford had. And early on, it's pretty hard to tell, and you can easily get confused between what Joe might draw or what Beauford might draw, but that changed fairly quickly. This next slide, I'm jumping ahead a bit. This is also Beauford Delaney. This is Green Street, and this is painted 6 years after the image which I just showed you. This is from 1940 in oil on canvas. And I can see flashes of, well, Marsden Hartley, Arthur Dove, Stuart Davis, and probably other artists. And this, the two brothers lived in New York during a time, this is in Soho, when Soho didn't really exist. Well, I mean, it certainly didn't exist in terms of galleries. The streets were there. In fact, Beauford worked as a guard and caretaker for years in the early 1930s, right here in this building, when it was still the Whitney Studio Galleries. He also was given living and studio space in the basement, according to Avis Berman's biography of Juliana Force, the Whitney's founding director. And I recall until fairly recently that there were students now and again that were sort of custodian types living in the school. So I think that has sort of, that tradition has really continued. I doubt it's still happening now, but who knows? We won't tell the fire department, whatever. Beauford debuted here with 3 pastels and 9 oils in the Whitney show that was titled Four Sunday Painters, an exhibit curated by Juliana Force. And though she acquired 2 pastels, Force mistakenly pegged Beauford as a naïf or self-taught artist. This misidentification, based largely on the fact that Beauford was black, and therefore marginal to most in the white world, dogged Beauford through the years and intensified again decades later in Paris in 1973 at his exhibition there at Galerie Dorothea Speyer, after Henry Miller, one of Beauford's many, and underline many, literary lionizers, described him in the illustrated brochure, quote, In everything Beauford is self-taught, a true autodidact." Well, that's really off base, but anyway, he was, if anything, as self-taught as Van Gogh. This is a portrait of Joe Delaney by his brother Beauford Delaney, done in 1933. This is a pastel on paper. And this next image is, I'm switching, is Joe Delaney in a painting in oil from 1932 called Coney Island. And you can see on the right it says Fire Eaters, sort of a sideshow and this merry-go-round thing and these kind of strange, it's a dark painting. This is at the Art Institute in Chicago. And in many ways, the style that we're looking at right now, Joe never really ventured into the avant-garde precincts that his brother dove into. This is called Jobs Not Guns. This is also by Joe Delaney, 1936. pencil and gouache on paper. It's about 24 by 24. I'm not going to give you dimensions. Joe was on the New York Federal Art Project of the WPA from 1936 to 1939. Quote, "It was like a dream, living like a rich boy," recalled Delaney in a recorded interview with me in 1980. Joe also worked with Edward Lanning on the very large mural project that is up at the, still there, in the big library on 42nd Street. And Joe would go off and work on the murals. It was a whole big team. And I've heard, and I haven't really seen it, but a Charles Alston mural in Harlem, apparently Beauford Delaney worked on at one point. This is also Joe Delaney called Artist Studio Party. And one of the things that I've noticed going over a lot of the material of the two brothers, Joe was really an outsider and a loner. And his art pretty much reflected that in terms of he tended to be outside, roving around, sketching, and very different from Beauford, which we'll see as we go along. This, by the way, is from circa 1940. I chose the Delaney brothers as a subject for a variety of reasons, the strongest being their compelling painting styles and relative underknownness as important American, I should say important but very different, American artists of the 20th century. First off, they are radically different personalities. They developed a way of seeing and painting in separate circumstances, joined only by a grinding poverty. I met Joe in New York in the late 70s and was awed by his gritty independence despite the most amazing living conditions. In a chaotic and dank studio on Union Square West, often without heat or elevator service on the weekends. Tall and rangy, the tobacco-chewing and hard-drinking Delaney lived on the 9th floor and ate most of his meals out in fast food restaurants. At the time, he was in his mid-70s. He told me, "I don't have any choice but to hold on and carry on." And Joe, like Beauford, by the way, lived in New York from, say, 1929 to 1952 and then moved to Paris. Joe always stayed in New York and lived in many places, and he moved when the buildings were demolished. And if you sort of followed his tracks, if someone did that, you could probably do the real estate development story of New York City. He had a loft on Worcester Street in Grand when it was a paper recycling center. Anyway, both brothers were right there in New York when lots of things were happening. I only learned about Beauford shortly before his retrospective show of 67 works at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1978, just a year before he died at the age of 77 in a Paris mental hospital. I'm talking about Beauford now. Like de Kooning at the time of his retrospective at the National Gallery of Art, Beauford too suffered from some form of Alzheimer's disease and other mental illnesses, and was unaware of the New York exhibition and subsequent accolades. His longtime friend, James Baldwin, this is a pastel that Beauford did of James Baldwin in 1945 from the estate of James Baldwin. Anyway, he came to meet Delaney in 1940 at his studio on Green Street, long demolished and now occupied by the high-rise towers of NYU's Washington Square Village. Baldwin was still a teenager in high school, and now jumping to this time of the show, was part of a Paris committee looking over Delaney's welfare that made the show at the Studio Museum possible. So although Beauford finally got his so-called do in New York. He neither participated in choosing the images, giving information, and much of the catalog, when you look through it, really it's kind of a mystery, an interesting mystery for sure. Getting back to James Baldwin, in one of the biographies of Baldwin, he wrote that Beauford taught me how to see and how to trust what I saw. For the young writer, Beauford was, quote, the first walking, living proof for me that a black man could be an artist. I wrote a commemorative piece about Delaney in the show in Arts Magazine, in the one-time Arts Magazine. The first published treatment in an English art magazine of the artist, I believe, since painter Paul Jenkins' graceful overview in Art International in 1962. Joe and Beauford, by most accounts, were not that fond of one another. Joe, a rather introverted ladies' man, did not approve, to say the least, of Beauford's open homosexuality and the remarkable avant-garde / intellectual social set that gathered around him, both in New York and Paris. Joe always lived under the shadow of his brother's charismatic personality and underground fame. The two were as different as, say, Jackson and Charles Pollock. Joe and Beauford showed together in 1940 at the American Negro Exposition in Chicago, and Joe had one show in 1944 at the Roco Gallery in New York. Some of you here apparently recall that place, where his brother frequently exhibited. But once Beauford took a boat to Europe and the post-war Bohemia of Paris in 1953, the distance between them truly grew. The Picasso-sized Beauford, as Jenkins recently recalled, became a talisman of the art world. I'm going to show some more slides of Joe Delaney's work, pretty much chronologically, followed by Beauford's, which are generally tougher to date, especially in the 50s and 60s when he took up abstraction, but continued to paint a galaxy of stunning portraits. There's Philippe and Sylvain Brier are working on a catalog raisonné of Beauford Delaney, and a lot of this is going to eventually be straightened out. Probably quite a bit of it is now. Both artists, though, both Beauford and Joseph, were essentially easel painters. Now I'm going back to Joe. This is George's Bar, circa 1940. And according to Joe, George's was the Studio 54 of the day on 7th Avenue and Barrow Street. Quote, soldiers, freaks, and you name it, everybody came in there to get a taste of life in the village. It was a hell of a place. This is called Chelsea Bar, from circa 39 to 41. Quote, back at that time, a joint was open on every street. You could do whatever you please between midnight and dawn. Recalled Joe, who I'm sure did it all. You'll see again as we go through here chronologically that there's not going to be a terrific amount of change. Joe, like painters such as Raphael Sawyer, never jumped into other movements, never really experimented outside that figurative realist tradition. This is called Preaching Gospel, also from 1940, and I believe this certainly echoes Joe's roots. This is called Bird's Funeral, and when I first heard the title, I said, oh yeah, it's an ode to Charlie Parker, and then I go, oh no, it's 1941, and then I'm looking at it, and this is, you see the feet up pigeon there in the middle, laid out, and the other pigeons sort of circling around. I mean, there's a real poignancy there. and humor, but there's something about it that here's someone that saw that and did that painting. And I don't think it was from his imagination. I think he saw that in some way. This is called Art Students League Cafeteria, 1941. Joe continued to take life classes. He was a life member and very proud of it at the Art Students League on 57th Street for virtually every day he spent in New York. That would go up until at least his mid to late 70s before moving back south to Knoxville in the early 80s as an artist in residence at the University of Tennessee. Now, Joe left New York in Union Square, and personally for me, I don't think it was a very good move for him. But Alex Haley, who was there in Knoxville, encouraged Joe to come down because he was living a very tough life here. And anyway, Joe went to Knoxville not only with all of his paintings, but with all of the paintings that he managed to get in Paris from his brother's estate, so to speak. And that's a real big can of worms that's being sorted out also. But even though Joe and Beauford weren't pals as adults, Joe spent a great amount of money and effort and pluck to get his brother's stuff back to where it belonged. So anyway, this is the Art Students League. Moving right along, I wanted to show just a couple of quick influences and kinships regarding Joe Delaney. Beauford Delaney, by the way, also studied for a while at the Art Students League. This is Thomas Hart Benton, July Hay. It's at the Metropolitan. Joe described Benton. Benton was a strange shot. Joe had a great way with words. Here's another. This is Florine Stettheimer, called Cathedrals of Broadway from 1929. It's an oil on canvas. Now, Joe was not aware of her work, but I just wanted to show that to kind of, I think these were two people who really shared a passion for the bright lights in the big city. This is Jackson Pollock after Pollock dropped the influence of Benton and moved on to abstraction. This is from 1943 called Pasiphae. As Joe said, Jackson was the strangest shot of all. Joe sketched a jaunty chalk portrait of Pollock with plenty of hair and sporting a bandana in April 1932 at the Washington Square Art Show on McDougal Alley. It was started in 1932, believe it or not, to help artists survive the Depression. I guess it's doing the same thing now. It was where Jackson Pollock first exhibited his work. Joe continued to participate in the outdoor shows every spring through 1974. He could do 25 portraits in a good day. So he says, and I believe him. This is Reginald Marsh, the Bowery, 1930, tempera canvas, also from the Metropolitan. And this is also from Joe. Marsh visited me in my studio and looked at my stuff. He said, "Why do you make them so damn hard to look at?" Well, he didn't make them too easy to look at either, but we shared the same interest in big-hipped women. Marsh died in 1954, and I don't know if he would have ever been tempted or influenced to change his style. But Joe certainly never did. Both Joe and his brother hung out in Washington Square. You'll see Joe observing the people in pigeons. Beauford was after something else, the spiritual geometry and Cézanne-like harmony of place. This is by Beauford Delaney. It's an untitled work, Washington Square Park, from 1951. Oil on canvas. And as we'll see with Beauford, I'll show you a couple, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead chronologically. This is Untitled from 1952. Sorry, I keep turning away from the microphone. This is Figure in the Landscape. And it's interesting to see how Beaufort becomes abstract, but it's still figurative, and you know the place and the space and the trees, but it's all kind of coming at you at the same time. It's very, I don't know, there's something that's quite alluring about all of this. This is called Idle. This, by the way, is, there are a couple of pictures in here that are on exhibit now on 57th Street, the Michael Rosenfeld Gallery. If you wanted to see that, it's up for till April 8th. It's a large group show. Now I'm going to jump back or forward, I'm not sure which, back I guess, to Joe Delaney. And this is called Waldorf Cafeteria, Greenwich Village, 1945. And this was one of the city's 24-hour places where artists and writers congregated, and no doubt other people too. And the critic Robert Pincus Witten singled out this painting and Joseph Delaney in a review in Art Forum in 1969, describing this as the self-mocking expressionism of Delaney, and mentioning a few people that I agree with, such as James Ensor, as possible influences. This was a show, by the way, that was at the Studio Museum. This next one, War Bond Rally, Times Square, 1949. And I was looking at this, and this is, you can see the sort of giant cash register. This is pre-digital, pre-computer time. And there's a bandstand, and I was wondering if that sort of interesting-looking fellow in the middle was Cab Calloway, but I don't know. Anyway, again, there's just a lot going on here. Again, you can see Joe is on the outskirts of this. He's participating, but he's participating with a sketchbook. He's not there with someone, he's there alone. And I think that really is a big difference between Joe as a recorder of spectacle, and probably also very patriotic. He spent some time in the Army. He was a master quick draw. This is from 1952, sketch artist in Washington Square. And just, if you can remember from a few images back, that work from about 51 of Beauford's from Washington Square, it's just so different. And the Empire State Building, you always see New York in Joe's paintings, because that's what he was all about. This is called The A Train, 1953. And this is View from South Ferry, 1954. This is also oil. Well, this is oil on masonite. This is 1955. Brooklyn Dodgers Victory Parade. This is charcoal and pencil. And he also did a large painting of this, very different. But again, something about the humor here and the way that he's able to capture and put down a lot of detail with both style and grace, really. I mean, if you look at this for a while, you'll pick up a lot about baseball, which now I guess doesn't exist so much, but it's, I like this. This is called Pretty Bess from 1957. This is oil on canvas. And Joe always did portraits, but again, when you see some more portraits by Beaufort, he did this to record, but it wasn't like pulling out from the inside what was in that person's soul, so to speak. Although this one, Jacob Lawrence from 1957, or as Joe says, Jake, this is also in the Art Institute in Chicago, which I think Joe would really flip the fact that he has two works. That first one, that early one of the merry-go-round in Coney Island is actually on display at the Art Institute right next to a Reginald Marsh painting, which some people sort of criticize that particular painting by Joe. I mean, in terms of they could have probably gotten something better, but anyway, so this is Jacob Lawrence. And oddly, I was talking to Joe once about Jacob Lawrence and about not so much him, but just generally politics and the WPA, because Joe was, I mean, he rode freight trains and was getting, chased by policemen and all kinds of things. And he never really talked politics. He just wasn't about that. And he did tell me he didn't like Lawrence's politics, whatever they might be. This is called VJ Day, Times Square, 1961. And again, Joe is returning to the same subject, I mean VJ Day, time and again. The parades, as he put it, is my theme. He liked the social harmony of parades. He'd seen race riots, but as he said, I wouldn't be inspired to paint one. This is Armistice Day Parade, Madison Square, 1962. Flatiron Building. There's another building standing now in the center of the picture, I guess, but we don't see that here because it wasn't up yet. And this is called Village Corner. This is so great. I mean, in terms of it's practically like you can throw a stone, and we're so close to all of these places right now. Village Corner, McDougal and West 3rd Street, 1965. And I could just see this on almost like on an album cover or something. I mean, in terms of like Bob Dylan standing right in the middle of the street there. This is from 1964. This is St. Patrick's Day Parade, also oil on canvas. And there are always touches in terms of, you see the pigeons on the sidewalk, the little brace of Yorkies there being held by that rather scary-looking woman. In the center, people taking pictures. You see the atmosphere, you see the architecture. And this next slide, Easter Parade 1 from 1965. There's a kind of macabre humor and skeletal outline of the figures that remind me at times of Domenico Tiepolo's Venetian Revelers and James Ensor's eerily masked promenaders, especially his painting The Entry of Christ into Brussels, Ensor's painting, that is. And that's Easter Parade 2 from the same year. And this is called Harlem Parade 2. So you're getting the idea that Joe went to lots of parades over the years. And I mean, he'd walk down from the League, he'd bump into some event, and he would record it. And then he would eventually paint it. And his studio was fantastic in that he had so much of his stuff there. And in the center, there's an open convertible, and the man standing on the left in kind of a halo with dark glasses is Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, the late and great Congressman Powell. And so, in a lot of ways, these are really documents of the time. And these figures on horseback. I mean, you start to think about history paintings, and in fact, Joe did go to France a number of times and marveled to me about the metro system there, comparing it to the one in New York, and about walking, moving elevators and things. And he said that after he had seen at the Louvre some paintings by David, he said he wanted to, if he ever got a big enough canvas, he wanted to record things really big. This is back at the Art Students League. This is a well-known picture from 1965. And this is Joe's homage to that magical corridor at the League on 57th Street, filled with a supporting cast of artists, students, and administrators. And some of you maybe in this room might even recognize some of them. I believe the man with the glasses by the statue is the longtime director of the League, Stuart Clonas. This next one, here's Joe in circa 1970, and this is Marble Collegiate Church. I was up at the Schomburg Research Center looking through these archival boxes of material on Beauford Delaney, which someone told me were literally found on the street outside of Joe's studio on Union Square West. And they, if this is accurate, they were miraculously then, they're now at the Schomburg Center. And inside all this stuff about Beauford's life and papers, there are these little cards of Joe's, of his donations to this church. He was, put money in the box all the time and committed a certain amount every year. I mean, it's kind of an interesting connections that he kept. That was, by the way, 74, circa 1975. This is 1978, called Around Henry Street. And at this time, Joe was with it was called the CETA Artists Project, and he was stationed, so to speak, at Henry Street doing paintings. And there was a big show there. And this is very different. This is much lighter. It's a whole different treatment. In a way, it's really more confident. It's not as kind of packed and crowded. You can see things in a more almost painterly way. And Joe told an interviewer in 1981, just before he had a show of his parade paintings there at Henry Street, that you learn as you go on to create form with light, and you don't have to use dark colors for strength. This next one is Macy's Day Parade. This is his largest work. It's 86 by 120 inches. Perhaps this is his seminal work on parades. And this is 1981, if anybody remembers this, the Hostage Day Parade. And this is the beginning of the Reagan administration, the wonderful 80s. And that big American flag you see sort of waving over it, you'll see that time and again in his paintings. And sometimes I'm not sure about Joe in terms of the way he puts things, and they seem very patriotic, but there's also an edge to them. And there's a terrific history here in terms of other American artists who have done parade paintings. There was a painter in Boston, for instance, Charles Woodbury, who did many works like that, and also Guy Wiggins in New York. And of course, Hassam did these sort of famous pictures of Fifth Avenue. This is Joe in 1978. This is in his studio at Union Square, and actually this is the background of that Easter parade painting, the Macy's parade painting in the back. And it's a photo by Sarah Wells, and you can kind of see just a tiny bit of the unbelievable clutter of his archive there, stacked up. And Joe's in an overcoat because it's really cold in his space. And U.B. Blake, 1981, and this sort of along the side, this tapestry of images that records Joe's life. I mean, not Joe's life, but he's recording U.B. Blake's life. And this is Know What You See. This is Joe's handmade primer on anatomy, which he was always thinking about publishing in a big way and distributing in a big way. And you can see the sort of skeleton in his head. And this last image is from one of his many, many sketchbooks. Now, I wanted to go move on to Beauford again. And this is Henry Miller, portrait of Henry Miller from 1944, and it's from the estate of Henry Miller. And in the 1945 chapbook, The Amazing and Invariable Beauford Delaney, Miller wrote, The night I speak of, Beauford showed us, I remember, some small canvases of street scenes. They were virulent, explosive paintings devoid of human figures. They were all Green Street through and through, only invested with color, mad with color. This is a stunning self-portrait from 1944 at the Art Institute of Chicago in their collection. And here you can see touches of Soutine in a kind of hyper-expressionist but still meditative gaze. And this, I think, is a really spectacular painting. Now, this is a portrait that Georgia O'Keeffe did of Beauford Delaney in the early 40s, a pastel from the Regis collection. And Georgia O'Keeffe recalls in a little book of drawings about memories of drawings. She said, I first met Beauford Delaney when he was posing for Mary Callery, the American sculptor. I found that he was a painter and posed for others because he had no heat in his studio and needed to keep warm. He seemed to be a very special sort of person, impossible to define, so I began drawing him too. O'Keeffe portraits, by the way, are exceedingly rare. She never even drew Stieglitz, for example. The Time of Your Life, this is 1945, the famed William Saroyan play. Collection, Al Hirschfeld. And here, Delaney's manipulation of space is again masterly and produces a really theatrical perspective. And I read somewhere that the figure far to the left in white, seated, might be Beauford looking at this set. This is Portrait of Dante Pavoni, 1948 pastel. And he was Beauford's closest friend in New York who urged him to go to Paris. And there's a spiritual, near religious glow to this work, even the way his hands are formed, and quite evocative of Piero della Francesca. His face, and you'll see this on a number of portraits, is kind of a pastiche of Impressionist colors. This is a work from 1950, untitled, from Yaddo, from the Whitney. Louise Nevelson helped Beauford get a fellowship to this retreat in Saratoga Springs. And this sort of mushroom leaf study is amazing in terms of where the artist and his concentration and what he was able to pull out of nature, I mean. And this is untitled Marian Anderson. You can see her in the red gown sort of up there above the musical graphs, and this is from '51, and it's a key painting by Delaney of this famed contralto. And it vaults portraiture and becomes a dazzling homage to one of the artist's heroes. She was the first black woman to sing for the Metropolitan Opera. And like Delaney, her reputation really bloomed in Europe. Now you're going to, and Beauford too is moving right along. This is 1954, and this is Chartres. And the light you see is diffused through stained glass, works as a mantra for Delaney, whether it comes from a great cathedral or the inner spirit of one of his portraiture subjects. And light is, I would say, his dominant theme and what he always talked or wrote about, and was fairly obsessed with getting as much light as he could, both in his studio and on his subject. This is an untitled abstraction from circa 1957, formerly in the collection of the novelist James Jones, who was Delaney's biggest collector in Paris. And it was painted at the artist's studio in Clamart, a suburb of Paris, where Delaney first developed his abstractions. It could have been painted there, that's my surmise. Before Delaney had the studio, he was living in modest hotel rooms in Paris. And the writer Richard Olney recalls that in his years at Clamart, Delaney spread white sheets on the floor of his garden apartment, an apartment that had great French windows looking onto his garden, in order to increase the light. Here's Portrait of a Man in Soft Light, undated, oil on canvas. He's seated cross-legged, but seemingly on thin air. And Delaney, writing to Mary Callery, that sculptor I mentioned before, who had made sculptures of Delaney's head, he writes, "My work grows and the color deepens. At the present, I'm completing a portrait, the first in about 2 years. It's very simple and pleases me, and also rather surprises me with its independence of what it seems to show of my expressionistic way so far." This is Portrait of a Man in Sunlight, undated, as his friend, the painter Ed Clark, who's actually here tonight, says, quote, "For me, Beauford was all about the figure." Now, there are camps of those who favor the figure paintings over the pure abstractions and vice versa. I find it invariable and amazing that Beauford executed both styles more or less simultaneously. He was not, for example, like Guston, who abandoned abstraction late in his career to take up his own fiercely figurative and crazy cat narratives. Delaney, it seems, thrived in both spheres. And I just want to read this whole issue about Beauford and was he a figurative painter, was he an abstract painter. In an interview with Joe Delaney that was done some years ago, the interviewer was asking about whether Joe had gone through these changes or whether he didn't, and Joe said, "You see, one of the most sensitive and emotional answers to that is that my brother, Beauford Delaney, for whom I have great affection and love, and all those things, followed trends that swept everybody just about in. Some others had a more pointed direction, and I'm probably one of those. Now, my brother Beauford, I give him credit for having perhaps a closer touch with the kind of intellectual sophistication that I never will have and never did have. And he seemed to be more comfortable with the group of artists in Paris. And he moved from impressionism to abstraction. And he tried to move back. I don't know." And I think this "I don't know" part, Joe, of course, didn't like anybody doing anything like that, but is something that I think will be discussed more about Beauford Delaney's work. I'm showing you now a couple of slides of by Van Gogh, and because I see a lot of connection between the two men, Delaney and Van Gogh, and I guess that's sort of a natural thing. And you can, if you look into it more, you can probably see more things about them. But essentially, this business about light and the way of capturing in a soul-like way the subjects, I think, are shared by the two. And they were both hounded by inner demons, of course. This is an untitled abstraction from 1958. And getting back to this issue about whether Delaney was just one of these self-taught artists, he was in Paris and in the center of things and surrounded by artists and musicians and actors and went to exhibitions. In fact, he wrote a letter to a friend in 1961. We have a wonderful retrospective at the Louvre of Mark Tobey's great work. It's wonderful to see the flag of the U.S. and the French flags together honoring the glory of painting. And I didn't quite get the right Mark Tobey slide, but that's another artist who I see an affinity with Beauford, and also someone who went around the clock and forth and up and down with various styles. This is an untitled abstraction from 1961, and this is, I had made a note here about Picasso had his blue and rose periods, and this was Beauford Delaney's yellow period, but really it's a whole part of, I saw this film, by the way, a short home movie that Ed Clark took in 1960 of Beauford in his studio in Paris, and the entire studio was covered wall to wall with these types of paintings. There was not a figurative picture in the place as far as I could see, and there was one wall or a portion of a wall where there are these images like artists have tacked up in their studio what images they like, and it was everything from Etruscan sculpture to paintings Piero del Francesco. So this question about Beauford and his paintings and his direction, I think, are pretty interesting. This is a photo, undated photo, probably in circa early 60s, James Baldwin. Beauford in the middle in the suit, and on the right is Baldwin's longtime friend, the Swiss artist Lucien Happersberger. And so this idea of Beauford being holed away in his studio, he was carrying on at the Dome and the Select, drinking his cognac and conversing with a huge assortment of friends. I don't have time to go into lots of personal. He had very, very hard times psychologically and, I mean, emotionally and financially. He was always supported by someone or another. He gave away huge numbers of his work. And this next portrait is of Delia Delaney, his mother, undated, and this is probably done from memory from an earlier work he had done in New York. And Beauford made one trip back to the States in 1969 to visit his ailing brother Samuel in Knoxville, but did not have a show. There was a major one that had been in the works in part to benefit the National Urban League. For several years it had been in the works. And there was a gallery on Madison Avenue that had agreed to, if they could get the exclusive rights to Beauford's work, would take it on, but it never was pulled off, and James Baldwin was trying to get people like Harry Belafonte to raise money. And anyway, by this time, Beauford Delaney had showed with Paul Fischetti in Paris, And he was a major dealer who was the first Paris dealer to show Jackson Pollock. And Fischetti was only interested in his abstract works, which was the opposite to Dorothea Speyer, who gave Delaney a big show in 1973 at her gallery. Delaney never pushed his career or market, and as I was saying, there was even an anecdote which Ed Clark told me of a bus driver who caught his attention one day, and Beauford was giving him a work because he loved people, and there was a big exchange there. This is a portrait of Sergei Radomsky. It's in the Metropolitan, recently into the Metropolitan Museum. And I think here, most successfully, there's this merge of the abstract and the figure, and it seems blinding even in this form. This is another close friend of both Baldwin and Delaney. This is Bernard Hassel from 1968. And this is, to me, a very supercharged portrait, very, well, with the colors and his attractiveness and just the whole thing about him. It's pretty amazing. This is Marian Anderson, which is very different, if you recall, from the one that was a much more complex sort of, ode to her before. And it's like a tapestry in terms of the surface. It's a pity that you can't really see this, but the way he built up the surface, and also apparently a lot of it had to do with how much paint he had, because a lot of times his paintings had to be thin because he simply didn't have enough tubes of paint. This is an auto portrait from 1965, very chiseled. He seems surrounded by a kind of halo of light, and with that jaunty kind of cigarette dangling from his lips and the red bandana. Everything about it is very much the artist in command. And it really looks, it's like bronze or something. This painting, too, is on exhibit now on 57th Street. This was the cover of a brochure of that Dorothea Speyer. And I like the way he's holding his cigarette there. You see the pencils in his shirt. And in the background is a portrait, which we'll look at here, that was in the Studio Museum show of portrait of Antonio Correo, undated. And this reminded, when I first saw it, I said, oh, God, Alice Neal, or thinking about Alice Neal portraits. But he's so slim, and the way his hands are folded, and he's in that big chair, and kind of, it's a very delicate work. The creases are because this was the brochure, and this is Delaney. And this is, again, this is a flip side to that image of him in his studio with nothing but abstractions. And these are all figure paintings, which we'll see quickly as I wind up here, believe it or not, with some more images of Beauford, Delaney. This one is untitled. It's a portrait, to me anyway, a portrait marriage of Giacometti and African art. Oddly and most unfortunately, despite his quintessential New York-Paris roots, with 26 years logged in each of those cities, Delaney was not included in the Centre Georges Pompidou seminal show, Paris, New York, in 1977, or for that matter, the Modern's 1984 blockbuster, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinities of the Tribal and the Modern. And as we look here at some of Beauford's work, and it's a kind of startling imagery that pops up, and you kind of say, well, where does this come from? And it's probably from looking at lots of different things. This is called Man with African Sculpture, undated, and the costumed figure. It looks like something out of a Matisse painting, perhaps, or... and this is called Little Totem of Light. And I was thinking that Jean-Michel Basquiat would have liked this painting. And it's interesting to think about certain people and when you're in New York and how Beauford left and never got really situated here in a big way. I mean, his... and this is, again, this is an untitled abstraction. Same person, same artist. And this is from the Art Institute. It's an untitled abstraction from 1965. And this is Rosa Parks, 1967. And I was looking at this, and it's just this, she's on a bench, but it's like she's floating or disappearing or just coming out of that light. And I'm thinking now, why Rosa Parks? I mean, this is like some of you, you know, the history or whatever, the woman who refused to give her seat up on a bus. This is not a bus, this is a bench. And then I'm thinking, and then I heard the story about that Beauford had run into when he moved to Paris and was in one of the gardens there, and these war widows would go around collecting small bits of change for permission to sit at these places, and he thought he was being harassed by this woman and simply didn't understand that, you know, he was supposed to give her some money and then did, and everything was okay. But maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe there was some autobiographical reference for him, no doubt, being who he was. And this is another version, which I have the title, which I don't know, She Ain't Getting Up, Mrs. Parks, from 1970. But going back just for... Oh, no, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. No, I'm really going the wrong way. Help! Anyway, you can tell we're almost finished. What I was about to say before I made that unfortunate move on this remote control was that the bench was also kind of in a garden setting and kind of wondering about sort of heaven or where these people go to that do these courageous things. And maybe Beauford might have been thinking about that. And we'll see what happens now. Fantastic. Look at that. Can I go ahead? Okay. We can lose one slide. So that was from 1970. And this is a kind of a shocking, well, it's a photograph of James Baldwin in Beauford. This is when Beauford was no longer kind of on his own, but was sort of shortly before he was institutionalized. And unfortunately, they used a photograph like this, or they cropped the head of that for his obituary in the New York Times in 1979 when he died. And it sort of, you know, made him look sort of like a crazy person, which was hardly the image that we need to leave with. Oh, is that the one we lost? Okay. Actually, if we could turn, that was the last abstract painting, but, I mean, an image, but could we turn the lights on? Because we have, through the courtesy of Philippe and Sylvain Brier, a small painting of Beauford Delaney, so just to get a sense of this texture that I was talking about before we open this up to questions or comments. Because actually I'm noticing there are several people here that knew Beauford in Paris and might have So, does anybody have any comments or questions?
I just want to clarify, you showed some of Joe's paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Were some of those reproductions that were in black and white?
Yeah, there were two or something that's in terms of they were paintings that were somehow taken in black and white. Yes.
So there was one reproduction of that no one knew the name of. I actually know the artist back then. Was one of them, just of a man with black hair.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Bob Shigio.
Uh-huh. Oh, who's on your in the film with the yeah.
Even my daughter recognized this one.
Oh yes, that was the one of the with the man in sunlight.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, this is Ed Clark, and he has this incredible home movie of Beauford in his studio from 1960 that I wanted to show, but it's sort of hard to get that.
One of you could say a few words about the standing of these two now in the art community and how they're looked upon.
Sure. Well, starting with Joe, there's a I had mentioned this guy Sam Yates at Knoxville at the university. They're planning some sort of exhibition there to show Beauford and Joe Delaney together. Standing-wise, Joe was from my knowledge of things, was a fairly difficult guy to deal with, especially in terms of parting with his paintings. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that did manage to get his paintings got them in kind of nefarious ways. So the university, he left, Joe went down to Knoxville and left some of his estate to the university. His work is in some collections, but I'm not aware, Michael Rosenthal would probably know more about it in terms of what material is available. Beauford is another story in terms of, he's had several he had a very major show here in New York at Philippe Rieu Gallery, which is it's on Broadway and Spring Street, and I think his work it's more out there, if that's what you mean. In terms of, if we went to Sotheby's or Christie's, I think we'd have a hard time finding any auction records of either one of them. I mean, in that sense, it is somewhat difficult in terms of what their paintings are going for. But Beauford, I mean, there's, at least that I know of, 2 biographies in the works on Beauford Delaney, and just from the sheer weight of the literary world that knew him, I think it's harder for I think his work has a bigger chance of staying unknown. Now, what I didn't, because I lost this last bit here about that question, which is a very good question. I was going to end with this last slide to say, and here we go again back to my speech part, a last word on Beauford, and this is in his own words from a travel piece written by David Butwin on James Jones in Paris that appeared in 1969 in the Saturday Review, and this conversation took place in Beauford's studio. And the journalist Butwin writes, Jones talked about Paris, the light that attracted artists, the lure it held for Negro writers. This is in 1969. Beauford shook his head, quote, I don't think about Paris as a Negro. I'm accepted here, but Boston was also open to me. And I'm not here because of the light. Light is universal. It's in one's heart. Paris is marvelous if, like Mahalia Jackson used to sing, you have within you the power of the Holy Ghost. I'm in Paris because I'm dust in the wind. The wind blew me here, and I stayed because I wanted to grow and become me. Someday, the wind will blow me away, but when I'm gone, maybe my pictures will live. So that's really your answer. And that was, sort of forgot that. All right. Anybody else?
I'm Norris Spire, Dark.
Oh, yes, yes.
I met him a few times.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't very well, but he's one of the sweet, gentle people that I could have possibly met. And he had a tremendous sense of humor. We were always enjoying him very much. And he certainly had a position.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't well off ever at any time. And he did a lot of portraits of my family. He did one of my sister, one of my brother, one of my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you should get a hold of those reproductions.
Mm-hmm.
I particularly like his portraits.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm on to that side. And in fact, I'd never seen his abstractions
Mm-hmm.
before until Philip showed them
Mm-hmm.
in the gallery.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very interesting dichotomy.
Yes.
But I want to congratulate you, on the presentation.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much. I almost tried to get in touch with you. One of the people I didn't quite get to before. Yeah. I've heard, by the way, I mean, everyone that knew Beauford Delaney told stories about what an incredible guy he was in terms of all that. Ellen.
That's a funny story about Joe. I showed his work in the early 80s. Early. Sort of too early, but
Yeah, this is Ellen Schrago.
I had a hard time with the museums. They really weren't ready to deal with it. And someone had come down from the Whitney, and I showed them all these great paintings of the jigsaw today, and they said, "No, we're only buying masterpieces now." And I won't mention the curators, but talking about Joe not wanting to give up the paintings, he literally would come to the gallery just about every day to see them. They were like his children, and when he didn't come, he would call me and say, "Are they still there?" And then he'd come in and look, and then he'd go home, and a few hours later, he'd say, "I didn't see such and such on your wall," and I said, "Well, it was on the wall, Joe, and it's still on the wall." He just really didn't want to let them go. It was very hard.
There are also so many similarities that I mean, hearing this, because I just heard from Ed Clark was saying that in this, Beauford was going to be in the show Harlem on My Mind at the Metropolitan Museum, whatever year that was. But he didn't really want to send a painting in because he was worried that maybe something would happen to it. So he sent a work that wasn't, or had a work that wasn't really very good, or that really made a big impression.
You know what he said? He said, "You never get these things back." He didn't know how to take them.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in those, there are lots of similarities in terms of the brothers on those levels anyway. Yes. Yeah, in Tennessee, he did. Joe was an artist in residence. He had, but once Joe left New York, it was like, it's like some plants you can't transplant or something. I mean, he did not take to that place. Some of it he did, but New York to him was his, he went, he could go out and be at Union Square Park, and if he could, he was just in the Art Students League. It was, it's like he missed that a lot.
He used to come back once or twice after he left.
Yeah, he'd run away. Mm-hmm.
I was at the studio, and when we got downstairs, I said, "Okay, let's take the bus." I said, "This is a day of celebration." We took a cab.
That's interesting.
The value of doing a proper kind of
Well, his favorite was Joe, that is, riding these double-decker buses that went down Fifth Avenue, and they would go through, apparently, the arch at Washington Square and go around, and he talked about riding with Reginald Marsh on the bus and different, and I can just see him just going along, looking, and, you know, it's like in his element. Anybody else have a comment or question?
I just want to mention, it seems to me too when I come across articles even more recently on Beauford, Delaney. I think it's Eleanor Hardy. Is it Eleanor in Latin America?
Oh, maybe.
With Hardy, the year, last year. Everyone seems to be attracted to, you know, his figurative work much more so than his abstraction. And I guess I was just wondering, have you come across some scholars or critics who like to talk more about his abstract?
No, I actually haven't. I know that, I mean, personally for me, I mean, the more, I've seen more of the figurative works, but I'd like to see a show of one grouping of things. I mean, the Brie show that was, I think in 93? Yes. Yeah, had, yeah, it was a huge show, but I'd like to see maybe a show that really gives a major look at these abstract works. But as to your question, I don't really know any other. Well, it's much easier because you can then talk about James Baldwin, you can talk about all these famous people, and there's a lot of jazzy stuff that you can just bring in and not, it's, you know, there's more heat there in a way. I mean, for, say, somebody writing about it in a way. Thanks.